A movie that almost nobody in Hollywood believed would work just broke one of the most significant box office records in the history of biographical filmmaking. And it did not just break the record, it shattered it in a way that left industry analysts struggling to find the right framework to explain what they were actually watching happen in real time. The film is Michael. The subject is the most famous entertainer who ever lived. And the number that changed everything is $977 million and climbing toward $1 billion in worldwide box office revenue from a biographical film about a man who has been dead for 16 years. To understand why that number is so extraordinary, you need to understand what it displaced. Oppenheimer. The Christopher Nolan directed biographical drama about the father of the atomic bomb was released in 2023 and went on to become the highest grossing biographical film in cinema history, earning approximately $952 million worldwide. It won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It was considered by virtually everyone in the industry to be the definitive proof that adult audiences would show up in massive numbers for serious biographical filmmaking when the subject matter and the execution were at the highest possible level. Michael has now surpassed it. A biographical film about a pop star has out-earned a film about one of the most consequential scientific events in human history. A film that received a 38% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes has out-earned a film that received nearly universal critical praise. And a film starring a first-time actor in the lead role has produced box office numbers that veteran studio executives are calling among the most surprising commercial outcomes they have witnessed in decades. The story of how this happened is not simply a story about a movie. It is a story about the specific and extraordinary relationship between Michael Jackson and the generations of people who grew up with his music. It is a story about the power of a catalog that was already legendary and has now been reactivated for an entirely new generation. At the same moment, the older generation that first loved it has returned to feel something they had not felt in years. And it is a story about the complicated intersection of art and controversy and commerce that makes the Michael Jackson story unlike almost any other in entertainment history. Start with the film itself and the decision that was made before a single frame was shot that would define everything that followed. The production company and director Antoine Fuqua made a deliberate and significant choice about the scope of the story they were going to tell. The film covers Michael Jackson's life from his childhood in Gary, Indiana, through the 1988 Bad World Tour. It ends there. It does not address the abuse allegations that were brought against Jackson during his lifetime. It does not engage with the documentary Leaving Neverland and the accounts that film brought to public attention. It presents the story of a child prodigy who became the most famous performer on Earth, and does so within the chronological window it chose to explore. This decision was immediately and intensely controversial. Critics, who assigned the film its 38% Rotten Tomatoes score, cited this omission repeatedly. Reviews in major publications described the film as hagiography, as fan service masquerading as biography, as a fundamentally dishonest portrait that selected which parts of its subject's life were worth examining and simply declined to engage with the rest. The critical consensus was that whatever the film achieved technically and performatively, it was doing so in service of a selective and therefore misleading portrait of an extraordinarily complex human being. And then the audiences arrived. The audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is 97%. That number is not a rounding error. It is not the product of a coordinated fan campaign in any provable sense. It is the documented response of hundreds of thousands of people who watched this film and reported an experience that was fundamentally different from the one the critics described. The gap between 38% and 97% is one of the largest critic audience divergences in modern box office history for a film of this scale. And this is that gap that explains almost everything about what happened commercially. The people who went to see Michael were not primarily going to engage with a documentary examination of Michael Jackson's life in its full complexity. They were going to experience something closer to what a concert film provides. They were going to sit in a dark theater and watch someone perform Billie Jean and Thriller and Beat It and feel the specific emotional response that those songs have always produced in the people who love them. They were going to watch the moonwalk and the physicality and the stage presence and remember or discover for the first time exactly what made Michael Jackson so different from everyone who came before him and from everyone who has come since. The film delivered that experience with a level of technical and performative quality that exceeded what most audiences expected. And the central reason it exceeded those expectations has a name: Jafar Jackson. Michael Jackson's nephew had never acted professionally before this film. He had grown up aware of his uncle's legacy in the way that any member of that family would be aware of it, which is to say inescapably and completely, and with a complexity that outsiders cannot fully appreciate. When he was cast in the lead role, the response from much of the industry ranged from skeptical to dismissive. The argument was logical. Biographical films succeed on the strength of their central performance. Casting an untested first-time actor in the most demanding possible role for a debut seemed like a significant risk that could undermine everything else the production was trying to achieve. What Jafar Jackson delivered on screen is the reason the film earned $977 million and counting. The physical resemblance is remarkable, but physical resemblance alone does not explain what audiences responded to. Actors who look like their subjects have delivered performances that did nothing for the films they appeared in. What Jafar Jackson brought to the role was something that cannot be taught in an acting class and cannot be produced through physical preparation alone, however rigorous. He brought an understanding of his uncle's movement and presence and energy that came from a lifetime of proximity to the person he was portraying. The specific quality of Michael Jackson's relationship with a stage and with an audience and with the music itself was something Jafar had observed not through research or archival footage, but through actual human proximity over years. The performance scenes in this film have been described by audiences who differ on virtually everything else about the movie as genuinely extraordinary. Critics who gave the film poor reviews frequently acknowledged that Jafar Jackson's work was the element that most exceeded expectations. The moonwalk, the vocal performances, the stage presence during the concert sequences. These have been cited repeatedly in audience reviews as the moments that justified the ticket price and that produced the emotional reactions that drove the word of mouth, which drove the box office to the numbers that are now being discussed. Antoine Fuqua, as director, brought a visual sophistication to the concert sequences, specifically that elevated them beyond what biographical music films typically achieve. Fuqua's background in directing films with significant action and kinetic energy translated into concert sequences that captured not just the performance, but the atmosphere and the stakes and the specific electricity of watching Michael Jackson perform live. For audiences who had experienced that electricity in person, those sequences were a form of remembrance. For audiences who were too young to have been there, they were a first encounter with something they had previously only heard described. And that brings us to what may be the most commercially significant development to emerge from this film's release, and it is a development that extends well beyond the box office. Billie Jean is number 1 on Spotify. Not among classic songs, not among throwback playlists. On the main chart. Competing against and defeating songs released in 2025 and 2026 by artists who are actively recording and promoting and touring right now. A song that was released in 1982 is currently the most streamed song on one of the world's largest music platforms. This is not an isolated phenomenon. Thriller, Beat It, Smooth Criminal, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Black or White. These songs have all seen streaming numbers increase dramatically following the film's release, and the numbers have sustained rather than spiked and dropped in the way that most viral moments produce. The audience that went to see Michael and experienced those songs in a theatrical context went home and continued listening. They added the songs to their playlists and left them there. They shared them with children and younger family members who had not grown up with the music, and those younger listeners added the songs to their own playlists. The streaming data tells a story about generational transmission that the film catalyzed, but that the music itself is now sustaining independently. Michael Jackson's catalog is being discovered by people who were not born when he died. It is being rediscovered by people who loved it when it was current and had not listened closely in years. The combination of those two audiences is producing streaming numbers that the industry typically associates with current active artists at the peak of their promotional cycles. This is what makes the commercial story of Michael the film different from the commercial story of most successful biographical films. Oppenheimer earned its money, and the story ended at the box office. The film about J. Robert Oppenheimer did not cause people to go home and develop a renewed or new relationship with nuclear physics. The cultural impact of the film was significant, but it was primarily concentrated in the theatrical experience itself and in the awards conversation that followed. Michael the film is operating as an entry point into an ongoing cultural relationship with an artistic catalog. People are leaving the theater and continuing to engage with Michael Jackson in a way that generates commercial activity, streaming revenue, merchandise, renewed interest in his previous documentary and interview footage that is creating a broader ecosystem of economic activity around a legacy that was already the most commercially significant in popular music history. The estate of Michael Jackson, which has managed his catalog and his legacy since his death in 2009, has described the film as the most significant catalyst for renewed public engagement with his work since the years immediately following his death. The streaming numbers support that description quantitatively rather than just qualitatively. Now let's talk about the critical audience divide, because it is one of the most interesting cultural phenomena that this film has produced, and it deserves more analysis than it typically receives in the conversations about the movie. The critics who gave the film its 38% score are not wrong about what the film omits. The abuse allegations against Michael Jackson are real allegations that were made by real people and that have been the subject of serious documentary and journalistic investigation. A biographical film that chooses to tell the story of his life without engaging with those allegations is making a choice that has consequences for the kind of portrait it ultimately presents. This is a legitimate criticism, and it is made by people who take biographical filmmaking seriously and who believe that the form carries an obligation toward completeness that this film declines to fulfill. But the audiences who gave the film a 97% score are not wrong about what the film delivers within the scope it chose. If you accept the film's chosen parameters, which is to say if you are willing to watch a biographical portrait of a specific period in a person's life without requiring it to address the full scope of that life, then what the film delivers within those parameters is genuinely exceptional. The performance sequences are extraordinary. The central performance is remarkable for a debut. The emotional experience of watching Michael Jackson's music performed at that level is real and powerful, and for many audience members, clearly worth the price of admission on its own terms. The critical audience gap is in many ways a gap about what people believe biographical film is for. Critics tend to hold the genre to a standard of comprehensive truth-telling. Audiences tend to evaluate the genre based on emotional experience and entertainment value. When a film triggers one of the most powerful emotional responses available to a biographical film about a musician, which is the experience of great music performed brilliantly, the audience response tends to overwhelm the critical response at the box office, regardless of what the critical response says about the film's intellectual or ethical limitations. This dynamic is not unique to Michael. Bohemian Rhapsody. The biographical film about Freddie Mercury and Queen received significant critical skepticism, including substantial criticism of its historical accuracy and its handling of Freddie Mercury's personal life. It earned $910 million worldwide and held the record for highest-grossing musical biographical film until Michael surpassed it. The pattern of audiences responding powerfully to great music performed well in a biographical context, even when critics have significant reservations about the film, is now well documented enough to be considered a reliable commercial dynamic rather than an exception. If you have been watching this and you have thoughts about the movie or about Michael Jackson's music and legacy, I want to hear them in the comments. And if this kind of deep entertainment analysis is something you want more of, then subscribing to the channel is the best way to make sure you do not miss the next one, because we cover these stories in a way that most channels simply do not. The $1 billion question, and it is almost literally a $1 billion question at this point, is whether the film will cross that threshold. At $977 million, it is approximately $23 million away from a number that carries enormous symbolic weight in the industry. $1 billion in worldwide box office revenue has historically been the marker that separates the most commercially successful films from everything else. The films that have crossed it occupy a specific tier in the conversation about what movies are capable of achieving commercially, and what subjects and stories are capable of generating that level of global audience interest. The trajectory of the film's earnings suggests that the milestone is within reach. The rate of earning has slowed, as is normal for any film as it moves further from its release date, but it is not slowed enough to suggest the total will plateau short of $1 billion before the film completes its theatrical run. International markets where Michael Jackson's popularity was always particularly strong, including markets in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, have contributed substantially to the worldwide total and continue to generate revenue as the film reaches additional territories. If Michael crosses $1 billion, it will become only the second biographical film in history to achieve that level of commercial success. The conversation about what that means for biographical filmmaking as a genre will be significant, and the implications for how studios approach biographical projects about iconic musical artists specifically will be felt for years. The deeper story underneath the box office numbers is the story of a generation that grew up with Michael Jackson's music, and that had a complicated relationship with his legacy in the years after his death. The allegations, the documentary, the debates, the reassessments. These things created a period during which many people who loved the music found themselves uncertain about how to hold that love in relation to the other things they knew or believed about the person who made it. For many of those people, the film appears to have provided something specific, not a resolution of the complicated questions, not an answer to the difficult debates, but a permission to return to the emotional relationship with the music itself, to sit in a dark theater and watch someone perform Billie Jean at the level it deserves to be performed and feel the thing that the song has always made them feel, without having to resolve anything else in order to do so. That is a specific kind of permission that cinema is occasionally capable of providing, and that no other medium quite replicates. The theatrical experience creates a container for an emotional response that the same person might resist or complicate if they encountered the music alone at home with their phone in their hand and the internet available to remind them of every reason to feel conflicted. The The 97% audience score is in part a measure of how many people needed exactly that experience and were willing to pay for it. The new generation story is equally significant commercially and culturally. Young people who were children or not yet born when Michael Jackson died have now encountered his music in a context specifically designed to communicate its power and its cultural significance. The streaming numbers showing a 43-year-old song at #1 on global charts are the downstream commercial evidence of a cultural transmission that the film initiated. When Billie Jean appears in a film with the production quality and performative intensity that this film brought to it, and when an audience watches someone perform it with the level of commitment and talent that Jafar Jackson brought to the role, the song is no longer archive material to a young viewer. It is a discovery. It is something new that also happens to be old, which is the specific quality that separates enduring art from art that simply reflects its moment. The music industry has long understood that catalog value can be reactivated through film and television synchronization. But the scale of what has happened with Michael Jackson's music following this film's release exceeds what synchronization typically produces. A song placed in a film or television series generates a spike in streaming that typically lasts days or weeks. What is happening with Michael Jackson's catalog is a sustained reactivation that has persisted and in some cases grown since the film's release, suggesting that the film is functioning not just as a synchronization moment, but as a full cultural reintroduction of the catalog to audiences who are now engaging with it as a body of work, rather than as individual songs encountered in isolation. The commercial implications of this extend across multiple revenue streams simultaneously. Streaming revenue, merchandise sales, the estate's licensing revenue, concert film and documentary viewing on streaming platforms, all of these are elevated by the cultural moment the film has created. And all of them are likely to remain elevated beyond the theatrical run itself in a way that makes the total commercial value of this film to the Jackson estate substantially larger than the theatrical box office alone. Antoine Fuqua has spoken about the specific challenge of translating Michael Jackson's performance genius to film in a way that audiences who saw him live would recognize as authentic, while also making it accessible and powerful for audiences who had never experienced him perform. The concert sequences and the performance set pieces in the film represent the answer he developed to that challenge, and the audience response suggests the answer was effective. The critical response suggests it was not sufficient to compensate for the film's other choices. The box office represents the numerical summary of how those two responses balanced out commercially. What the story of this film will mean for biographical filmmaking going forward is something that studios and directors and producers are already actively discussing. The specific commercial lesson is complicated because the film's success is so tied to the specific nature of Michael Jackson's cultural position. He is not simply a famous person who has been made the subject of a biographical film. He is arguably the most famous entertainer in the history of the medium in which he worked, and his music is among the most widely known and emotionally resonant catalog ever assembled. The conditions that produce this film's commercial outcome are not easily replicable simply by applying the same formula to a different subject. But the broader lesson about the relationship between musical performance in film and audience emotional response and its commercial consequences is something that the industry will apply to future musical biographical projects. The gap between critical and audience response and its irrelevance to commercial outcomes in this specific genre is now documented at a scale that will be difficult to argue with. $977 million is a number that asks a question the industry has been trying to answer for years. What do audiences actually want from biographical film? The answer this film provides is not a complete one, and it is not without significant complications. But it is expressed in a number large enough that the industry cannot look away from it. Michael Jackson has been gone for 16 years. His music is #1 on Spotify. His nephew just delivered one of the most surprising debut performances in the history of biographical cinema. And a film about his life has just broken the all-time box office record for biographical filmmaking. The legacy does not need a resurrection. It never stopped. The film simply reminded the world of something it already knew and gave an entirely new generation the chance to know it for the first time. Leave a comment below and tell me whether you have seen the film and what you thought about it and whether you think it deserved to break the record or whether you think the critical score tells the more important story. I read every comment, and this is exactly the kind of conversation this channel exists to have. Subscribe if you want to be part of the next one.